Welcome to the Maple Shade Quilters quilt and coverlet display from the NYCHAPS archives. NYCHAPS is Northern York County Historical and Preservation Society. Our first group of quilts is whole cloth quilts. Whole cloth quilts is a quilt that's made of a single length of extra wide fabric. The quilting stitches themselves form the design of the quilt. Early whole cloth quilts were called linsey-woolsey, where the fabric consisting of linen and wool threads was first made. As better fabrics became more readily available, quilts made from white cotton fabric gained the moniker of white-on-white quilts. This is our whole cloth quilt. It is autographed, and it was made by the Franklin Church ladies in 1928. Our quilt down here is an autographed comforter from 1887. What distinguishes a comforter from a quilt is that it is knotted. You can see the knots in the quilt instead of any stitching, any quilt stitches. Our next quilt up here is a mid-19th century autographed with Bible verses. These are actually Bible verses in the center of these blocks. Down below we have a Lone Star. We can't show you the whole Lone Star, but it is a Lone Star cotton summer spread. Many years ago, in the summertime, instead of having a blanket, you would have a sheet, and then you would have a very thin bedspread on top. Up above here we get into our applique quilts. This is an 1853 applique quilt. And over here, this is around 1930 tulip applique quilt, and it was appraised for $500. An applique quilt is an ornamental needlework in which pieces of fabric are sewn or stuck onto a large piece of fabric to form pictures or patterns. As you can see, this is a tulip, 3 tulips in a pot. This is also a flower arrangement in a pot with circle and flowers inside and outside on the circle. Below here is a quilt that was pieced in 1890 and it was quilted in 1891. This was donated by Grace Pinter. This is a basket pattern, a very traditional quilt pattern. Over here we have a full-sized quilt from Washington Township. This is a very typical 9-block patch, and it is set, it's called on point, to make it look more interesting. And that was donated to NYCHAPS by Dora Kawate. Over here is our crazy quilt collection. A crazy quilt is often referred to the textile art of crazy patchwork. This patchwork lacks repeating motifs, and with the seams and patches heavily embellished with buttons, lace, ribbons, beads, or embroidery. Ours has lots of different embroidery on it. Crazy quilts are far more likely to use exotic pieces of fabric such as velvet, satin, tulle, or silk. This crazy quilt up here is one of our favorites because it is embroidered so wonderfully. And it's signed by Maggie A. Ross, the Ross from Rossville. This is 1888. Over here we have a crazy crib quilt. And this is a very heavy quilt. If you were to feel it, it's very heavy fabric. Down below here, we have a crazy quilt that's donated by Jim Shambaugh. Sorry. Our next quilt is actually technically not a quilt. It is a hand-pieced top and it is a hand-pieced backing, but there is no batting in between it. It was just donated to us this year, 2021, by Zara Bennett. Down below, we have a pink and white crib quilt that's around turn of the century, early 1900s. Beside it is another crib quilt from Washington Township, again donated by Dora Kawate. Let's go over to the right of that to show you our last quilt. And this is a very special quilt to NYCHAPS. This quilt was a surprise for Marlene Stifler. Marlene Stifler is a longtime member of NYCHAPS. Her mother, Verna Blauser Strayer, and Marlene's daughter, Marcella Stifler Drake, in 1971 made this quilt for Marlene as a surprise. This quilt will always be cherished by her. Next, we have our coverlet collection. Coverlets are woven bed covers used as the topmost covering on a bed. The weaver works on a loom to construct the textile itself, one row at a time, and the pattern is woven in as part of the process. There's two kinds of coverlets. One is geometric, and they have patterns based on circles and squares. The second kind of coverlet is figured and fancy. Figured and fancy coverlets have patterns based on floral, animal, and architectural features. The grapevine pattern in most of these coverlets is an example of figured and fancy. All of our coverlets that we have in our archives are the figured and fancy type. The first one over here is an 1840 coverlet from Washington Township, made by Martin B. Brenneman for Eliza Wander. The next coverlet is 1853, again made by Martin B. Brenneman for Henry Klug. That is a grapevine pattern. The next one is an 1854 coverlet. It is also a grapevine pattern, just in some different colors. Again, made by Martin B. Brenneman. And our next to the last coverlet is 1858, made by Martin B. Brenneman for Clarissa Klug. Our last coverlet has more white in it than colors. It was donated to NYCHAPS by Jay and Vivian Knob. And that concludes our quilt and coverlet display from the NYCHAPS archives. We wanted to show you some gems that we have that you don't often get to see. So I was glad to be able to bring them to you today.